I trust you'll enjoy our time in our Old Testament overview as we study the 39 books of the Old Testament. I consider this a great blessing to be able to do this with you, and we've provided some resources at pastorshawn.com/old, pastorshawn.com//old. You'll find a basic breakdown, an overview of every one of these 39 books there in that website. You also find videos and other resources that I'll be putting there to help you understand the beauty and significance of the Old Testament and the incredible picture it paints of a God who is working his eternal plan of redemption and the promise of a Messiah. And so again, pastorshawn.com/old for any one of the sessions, this session or any one of the sessions, you can find resources there. May God bless you as you walk with me through the Old Testament. Well, welcome to session number 7 of our Old Testament overview course. And again, just a reminder, you can go to pastorshawn.com/old to get the notes to follow along. And I'm glad you've joined us. And if you haven't seen the previous ones, you can pick up the previous sessions. There is a 1 through 6 that gets you to section 7. And now we're in the middle of, last week we dealt with Job and Psalms, and those are poetic books, much different than the historic books we looked at before. And now we're going to look at 3 more books of poetry, Proverbs, and then Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. And why it's important to note that Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon are poetry is because then you study it differently. If it's didactic, you take each line, it's building, it's logical. If it's narrative, it's telling a story, and you don't want to build too much significance into just something real simple where, and he took a drink of water. I mean, that may be important, but it may just be a part of the story. And with poetry, sometimes people will say, look, it says, praise the Lord 3 times, so we should always praise the Lord 3 times. Well, that's not the point. The point was poetry was echoing, and it's got different styles to it. And it's true of Proverbs, it's true of Psalms, it's true of each of these poetic books. So now let's jump into the book of Proverbs. The title and meaning, the Hebrew title of the book means Parables of Solomon. That's how it was known to the Hebrew people. Proverbs is a concise, picturesque truth designed to communicate a principle about life. And today, we just simply call it Proverbs. Again, it's poetry, as we talked about, section of the Bible. The author and date, Solomon's name appears at the beginning of 3 sections of the book, chapters 1 through 9, 10 to 22, and 25 to 29. Proverbs, which are attributed to the words of the wise, are found in chapters 22 to 24. It seems to be a collection that he has gotten together as a king. And other Proverbs are included, which were written by Agur in 30 and verse 1. We read that. And King Lemuel in chapter 31, verse 1. Solomon's Proverbs were probably written just prior to 931 BC, and some of his Proverbs were collected almost 230 years later by Hezekiah, and we know that in a reference here in the book itself. Poetry is the style, as we mentioned. It's also the section of the Bible. The theme is God's detailed instruction on how to deal with everyday life. These are just wisdom principles for everyday life. Proverbs 9:10 is perhaps a good summary of the theme verse. Some people would say Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. That could be a core key verse. But this one summarizes the concept of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is simply put, I understand who God is, and I understand who I am compared to who God is. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When I really understand how I fit into the universe as compared to the God who created me, sent Jesus to redeem me, then I'm going to have wisdom in life. And knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. The more we know God, the more understanding we have for life. Because the God who made us, he knows how he constructed us. And so he knows what's going to bring satisfaction emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally. He knows what will bring satisfaction and meaning to our lives. And then he has instructed us to help us understand how to live in such a way that we live with this harmony before God and harmony with other people so there's satisfaction. And in our world today, what's happened is we've thrown wisdom out the window. We've thrown how God constructed us, how God has instructed us out the window. And we think it doesn't matter what the Creator says. It doesn't matter what the Scriptures say. What he says is wisdom. I'm just going to live however I want to live because the best way for me to be satisfied and have meaning in life is do whatever I want to do. And actually, we have more people depressed, anxious, and upset in our world today because we're not living in alignment with how our God created us and how he's instructed us. And so I think it's so important for us to understand the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now, at a glance, the book of Proverbs, 31 chapters. As a matter of fact, in the month of October, we have been going through the Proverbs in our Take 5 daily devotionals. You can go to Calvary Westlake, take5.org, the number 5 at the end, Calvary Westlake, take5.org, or you can go to calvarywestlake.org and click on Take 5, the symbol there. And I write daily devotions. And in the month of October, I've been tracking. So on October 1st, we looked at chapter 1 and we found a proverb and applied it to our lives. Chapter 2, we looked at on the second day, and you can see 31 days. So on Halloween, we'll end with chapter 31. We'll pull out a principle or proverb for our lives then. And I've enjoyed that. I like going through the Proverbs that way. And you can do it 100 times. You're going to find a different proverb, a different line, a different thing that'll just the Spirit of God will bring to your own heart. The divisions are laid out there. I'll let you look at that chart. It's a little harder book to really get a good handle on for charting because it's a collection of these proverbs. Problems. Why aren't all of Solomon's proverbs here? 1 Kings 4:32 tells us that Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and we know there are about 800 in this book that are attributed to him. This would mean that 2,200 of his proverbs were lost. Now, some liberals and critics of the scriptures will say, see, there are errors. You should have all 3,000. Well, in God's sovereignty, those proverbs that God inspired are included. And just because some of what he had said was not included in Scripture does not mean that that which is included is error-prone. John says that his gospel did not include all the words and works of Jesus because the world could not contain that many books at the end of the book of John. Similarly, the book of Proverbs contains those proverbs God inspired and God wanted included. Now, are these Proverbs principles or promises? Now, that's important to understand. The book of Proverbs is full of principles, a general rule of thumb as you live a certain way. So if you walk with God and if you are faithful to your wife, then you're going to have a content and happy marriage. If you are sexually pure, the Proverbs are going to teach you, then there's going to be a greater satisfaction than if you are promiscuous and just engaged in sexual relations outside of what God intended. There's a distinction between a promise and a principle. Promises is certainly in life is going to be a certain way. So, in other words, if you do this, then this is going to happen. A famous one of these is Proverbs 22:6, where it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And some will hold on to that as a promise. It's actually not a promise, it's a principle. If you train your children up and you disciple them well, then they're going to be equipped to return in the future. They're more likely to return than if you don't raise them up in the things of the Lord, train them up in the Lord. But some people will say that means that sometime in that child's life when they're an adult, they will turn back to God. That's not a promise, it's a principle. And the whole book of Proverbs is full of those kinds of principles for life that help us in the direction of our lives and in the direction of our faith. The content, the main characters are wisdom. She almost becomes personified. He writes this, we believe, by the way, he writes Proverbs at the middle of his life, probably around my age. Probably got a young son, like I have a young son. And so he's addressing wisdom as her, the father, Solomon, the son would be any one of his sons, Rehoboam and others. Enticing woman is the woman who entices the man. The virtuous woman is the woman who is upright. Main events, the fear of the Lord, knowledge, wisdom, understanding, various topics on relationships, sex, money, family, marriage, work, friends. It's very practical to everyday life. Theological significance, God is wise, God is holy, God is truth. The personal significance then is you have a healthy view of God, and his perspective gives us the ability to live our everyday lives in a practical and healthy way. The Proverbs are very practical for everyday living. Now, I mentioned Solomon writes Proverbs, we believe, in the middle part of his life. And there's just such great wisdom. I'd encourage you, if you haven't done it before, just read through the book of Proverbs, read a chapter a day, aligning with the day. Some people have done this for years. Some people have done this for a year. Some have done it just for a month. And let God speak to you each day with the 31 chapters that would match up to the day of the calendar year in a month, and let God speak to you. It's a great, healthy pattern for practical everyday living. He wrote Proverbs in the middle of his life. We believe he wrote Ecclesiastes at the end of his life, probably in his early 60s. He is looking back. He is looking back, and he looks and he realizes that he's wasted a lot. He was David's son, King David's son. He inherited a kingdom that was at peace, had taken a lot of territory. David had conquered so much. David established Jerusalem as the city of God, where the temple would be. David asked God to allow him to build a permanent temple, not just the tabernacle that moved around all these years, for God in the center of Jerusalem. And God said, no, you've shed too much blood. Your son will do that. You prepare. So he had to do all of the campaign fundraising and getting everything together, the plans. And then Solomon built the temple. And Solomon was asked by God early on in his own life. God said to him, if I could give you anything, we talked about this when we were looking at 1st and 2nd Kings. Solomon, if you could have anything for me, what would you have? What would you want? And he could have asked for wealth. He could have asked for things of pleasure, could have asked for power, but he asked for wisdom. And so God said, you will be the wisest man that ever lives. And here is this wise man who, even though he was wise, chose to live many times a very immoral life. He had about 1,000 wives and concubines in his harem. Much of that people will say was he made peace deals with their kings, so he married their daughters to signify that peace between their nations. But he also was a sexually promiscuous person. He had a lot of wives and concubines. So how can a person be wise and be immoral? We'll talk about that. But this book gives us an opportunity to see through Solomon's eyes as an older man with great wisdom, looking at how he had everything. He had all the education, he had all the pleasures, he had all the stuff, he had beautiful gardens in Jerusalem, he had the great palace that God allowed him to build, he had the great temple to the worship of the Lord, he had all the women he wanted, he had all the wealth he wanted, he had all the power he wanted, and he looks back and he says, it's all empty. The whole thing of Ecclesiastes is an emptiness. And really the word Ecclesiastes is a play on the word preacher, and the book opens with the words just simply saying the words of the preacher and talking about Solomon. It's just a speaker. This is a poetical book again. The author and date, the opening words of the book identify these words in it as the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. That's pretty much Solomon. Some would argue it could be a great-grandson of David in the way they wrote in that day, but everything identifies this. Even as Solomon describes his life, it really matches up to Solomon. The style of writing is poetry. The theme and the key verse, life is vanity apart from God. It's empty. It's meaningless. You can have all the wealth. You can have all the power. You can have all the pleasure the world would offer, and it will still seem empty and meaningless, and you'll still be on a quest to fill something that is missing. Ecclesiastes 12:1, remember your creators. This is at the very end of the book, after he's talked about all these different things he's had, and he calls it all vanity, all emptiness, all meaningless without God. And he talks about under the sun. In other words, the human experience, if we just live it here on earth and we think it's wealth, power, and pleasure that's going to be fulfilling, we miss it. It's empty. But when we step back and we get the perspective God has above the sun, we see a bigger perspective and the eternal plan of God. Then he says, you've got to step back and you've got to remember your Creator in the days of your youth. He says, I was a wise man, but I was an immoral man, and I ended up with an empty life because I did not remember my Creator throughout my younger years. You can glance at Ecclesiastes there as its breakdown. This is the under the sun perspective. And I just want to really focus on how, before we move on to Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, how could such an immoral man write a book of the Bible? That's under problems there. Solomon is credited as having written 3 books. He was not given the gift of morality or faithfulness when he was given the gift of wisdom. The Lord has used a variety of people to record his word, but none of them was perfect. The Lord used them, though. One of the amazing aspects of the Bible is that a holy God used unholy men to communicate his holy word. Solomon had wisdom. He even made wise choices for his kingdom and for his people. One of the famous stories of Solomon and his wisdom was when the 2 prostitutes who each had a baby, one baby dies, and they both claim the baby that lives is theirs. And he says, bring a sword, let's divide this in half. this child. And as soon as he had the sword and was going to divide the child in half, one woman said, no, she could have it. And he knew that only a mother would release her child, give it to someone else to save its life. And so he knew that was the mother. He had great wisdom, but he had a lot of immorality. And he looks back as an older man and says, it's all empty. I hope that you have remembered the Creator now in your life, that you've leaned in and pressed in a relationship with God. Don't end up like Solomon. Don't end up like so many who late in life have so many regrets because they pursued pleasure, they pursued wealth, they pursued power and influence, and they left God out. Remember the Creator wherever you are in life. But if you're young, remember the Creator in your days of your youth. You got to know Him then. A life without God, the theological significance here is a life without God is no life at all. And then you really get back down to the personal significance is joy comes as we walk with God. We live life from His perspective, and we remember God and know Him, walk with Him, and obey Him early in our life than when we look back with so much regret. So you have Ecclesiastes is written later in life. Proverbs written in midlife for Solomon. And then the third book that Solomon wrote was the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. It's a little book of 8 chapters. It is poetry. It speaks of romance. This appears to be written by Solomon in maybe even his early to mid-20s. So he writes Song of Solomon. He's young. He's passionate. So he writes about love and romance and even sexual passion. This is quite the story here. Some question that it should be in the Bible because it's beneath God, but it shows that God intended human sexuality to be shared in a loving relationship of commitment and passion, and He has that. Some have said this has nothing to do with human sexuality. This is all a picture of our relationship to God. I think there are some applications to our relationship with God and our love for Him. But when you have parts of the body like breasts being described in this book, it's hard to just allegorize that and say it's God's people with God. It is a book that speaks about romantic, passionate love. And yes, there is an echo of that kind of love with God that is committed and is deep. But it does speak of personal love between a man and a woman within marriage. There's a falling in love stage of the first 3 chapters, as is described in the chart at a glance, if you look there. And then chapters 3 through 5, the beginning of 5, united in love. Then there's a struggle in love, and then there's growing in love. And that really does describe some of the stages of dating, of being engaged, of being newlyweds, and then of the various ups and downs of the marital experience. There's a courtship phase there in chapters 1 through 3, verse 6. And then there's the wedding phase from 3:6 through 5:2. There's a problem in the relationship, but then there's progress that comes. Fostering of love, fulfillment of love, frustration of love, faithfulness of love. The location is Israel. He's king of the United Kingdom of Israel, all 12 tribes. And I believe it's written over about a year's time. I missed the theme here. This is fidelity in song, faithfulness to the one we love, that we've committed, we made our vows to in marriage between a man and a woman in the bond of marriage. Song of Solomon 6:4 is perhaps one of the key verses. You are as beautiful as Tisra, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem, as majestic as troops with banners. It's hard for us to put that together, but it is imagery that is bold, it's beautiful, it's strong, and it speaks of the faithfulness and commitment of love. The problems, how should the book be interpreted? I mentioned allegorical. It ignores historical background, merely fictional. Dramatic. Its historical background only helpful in presenting the drama of evil versus good. Solomon is the evil work, and the shepherd is Christ. There's the typical, which is it's a type of Israel's relationship with God, or it's a type of the church's relationship to Christ, or an individual's relationship with God. And then there's the literal natural. Historical background and story are demonstrative of biblical love and marriage. And I believe it's more of that, the literal natural way it's written. Otherwise, you have to explain a lot of the sensual and passionate. The main characters, there's the Shulamite. And I just want to tell you, this woman is a Shulamite, and that's his love. That's his bride. That's his beloved in this writing. That's who he writes to in passion, and he describes physically and emotionally his love for her, the romantic, passionate love. And it's interesting that it's probably Abishag, and now I see a typo here that should say the Shunammite. If you remember, late in David's life, he's sick, he's in bed, he's dying, and they bring in a young virgin woman to keep him warm, which sounds strange, but he was at the stage where that was not a sensual thing. That was a woman who would serve the king by keeping him warm as he was dying. And what you see at the end of David's life is a fight for that woman that takes place. His sons fight over her. And we know from the traditions of that day that if there was this virgin who'd be in the court of a king, that whatever son ended up with that virgin as his wife, that would be the successor to the king. And so there is a fight over that woman. Now, having a Shulamite woman in Song of Solomon and a Shunammite woman in David's story, one of the things we've seen archaeologically is Shunammite and Shulamite is probably the same person. It's different descriptions of the same location. Why am I saying all this? I'm saying that the woman Solomon is writing to, that he deeply loves and is his beloved, I believe, is the young virgin that kept David warm. And as Solomon is appointed king by his father, her affection goes to him, and this becomes his main love and wife early in life. This is before he's added all the 999 other wives and concubines. There's something simple and pure and committed about this relationship that Solomon has. And it's to be a beautiful picture of what God intends for human sexuality and fulfillment and romantic love within that marriage relationship. Again, it pictures, though, commitment and faithfulness to our God. But the first application of this is to our own lives. The personal significance, the love relationship in marriage is a beautiful expression of the faithfulness and intimacy when carried out from God's, not the world's perspective. And we need to understand this is God's perspective of what human sexuality, what human love between a man and a woman is to be within the commitment and bonds of marriage. The Song of Solomon, I think, is a wonderful book that shows us that our God understands all aspects of how he created us. He's not embarrassed that we're sexual beings. He's not embarrassed that we don't just use sexuality to procreate, but it's also for pleasure. We believe he created, and I think Song of Solomon shows this, he created human sexuality not just for procreation, but also for pleasure, to deepen the intimacy between a man and a woman who are committed in marriage. These are three great books by Solomon. He writes Song of Solomon. He's young and passionate to the first and key love of his life. In Proverbs, we get him writing in middle life words of wisdom to perhaps his son who's in his 20s. And then late in life, we get this very successful, had everything there was to offer in the world man, looking back in his wisdom and realizing he left God out of his life. And he tells us to remember the Creator in the days of our youth. These are three important books in the Old Testament, three beautiful books of poetry that speak much about how we walk with our God and how we live in this world with each other. God bless you. I'm looking forward to our next session together in our Old Testament overview.